So thank you all for joining us today for our last session in our Genocide and Human Rights Studies webinar series. My name is Megan Reed and I'll be the moderator for today's session. And throughout the series, we hope to have provided a platform for learning about cases and theories of genocide and human rights studies. And the series was created in response to COVID-19, which unfortunately led us to cancel this year's annual Genocide and Human Rights University program. This 2-week graduate level program is hosted at the University of Toronto, and it brings together 20 to 25 students from all over the world to learn from some of the most renowned scholars in their respective fields. The mission of the Institute's university program is to encourage a new generation of scholars to engage in research and publication in the field of genocide and human rights studies. To date, over 400 students from 40 different countries have graduated from this program, and many of the graduates have gone on to do research, publish, teach, and raise awareness about the nature of genocide, the importance of human rights, and the necessity of genocide prevention. For more information on this program, my colleagues at the Institute will be sharing some of the website links in the chat box. I will also note that throughout this webinar, if you have any questions that you would like to ask throughout the webinar, please raise your hand. And any questions that you would like to have addressed at the end during the Q&A, please use the Q&A chat box. The discussion questions that were circulated will also be posted in the Q&A chat box there. So feel free to refer to those if you would like to look at those again. Now, it is my great pleasure to introduce you to our panelists today, Professor Elisa von Joeden-Forgey. Professor von Joeden-Forgey is an associate professor in the Department of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Keene State College. She was the Dr. Marcia Radikoff-Grossman Professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Stockton University of New Jersey, and the first vice president of the International Association of Genocide Scholars. Prior to this, she was a visiting scholar and lecturer in the Department of History at the University of Pennsylvania. She has received research grants from the Fulbright Foundation, the Social Science Research Council, the Ford Foundation, and the MacArthur Foundation, and has widely published in the fields of comparative genocide and German history. She is currently completing a book on gender and the prevention of genocide that will be published by the University of Pennsylvania Press. Professor von Joeden-Forgey has taught the Gender and Genocide Unit for many years at the Institute's Genocide and Human Rights University program, and we're so happy to have her here with us today to speak about this very important subject, gender, genocide, and white supremacy in the United States. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Megan, and thanks to everybody who is here virtually at this webinar. I'm looking forward to what I'm expecting will be a very interesting conversation, and I certainly hope that I'm able to spark that sort of a conversation. So as Megan said, if you want to ask a question while I'm speaking, just raise your hand and she's going to interrupt me and ask and allow you to ask the question or ask the question for you. And I'm happy if that's what you like to do. And then if there's a question that you think can wait until the end or that may need sort of longer discussion or a comment that you want to make, please type it in the chat and then Megan can read it off at the end and we can discuss it more. So when the Zoryan Institute asked me and the Genocide and Human Rights University program asked me to sort of speak at one of these webinars, I usually speak at the GHRUP summer program. I usually speak on gender and genocide, and it's a 3-hour module, and it's and we get sort of deep into the various theories of gender and how they've complemented our study of genocide. But given what's going on in the world, and particularly in the United States where I live and work, I thought it would be useful to discuss white supremacy, right? And the history of white supremacy in the United States and how gender can help us see, I believe, some of the genocidal dimensions of white supremacy in the United States, particularly in the way white supremacy affects and is applied to Black Americans. So I'm hoping that that is something we can discuss. And particularly, I'm interested in your thoughts about how a genocide framing can be helpful, if at all, in thinking about reconciliation, accountability, and social healing of this long-term problem that we have faced in the United States. So I've titled this Genocide, Gender, and White Supremacy in the United States, Connecting the Dots, because we have three sort of different fields here: the field of genocide studies, the field of gender studies, and then the field of sort of African American studies, slavery studies, studies of white supremacy, ideology studies. And they have not, they've overlapped at significant moments, but not with, at least in dominant genocide scholarship, they have not overlapped, all three of them, for consistent amounts of time. And so this subject is, in dominant scholarship, very under-theorized and underappreciated for its importance as a case study, and for its importance as a case that can, I think, contribute to a deeper understanding of what the genocidal process actually is. So we're going to be connecting these three different fields together, and we can talk a little bit at the end about why thus far, and I do discuss this a little bit in the webinar, but why thus far these three fields have remained somewhat distinct. I want to start with, and I start the summer program also with my Gender 101 slide, which is just for those of you who don't do gender studies. It's kind of an overview of the last 40, 50 years of insight that's been generated through the study of gender and through the study of feminism. So gender is not only about women, men are gendered subjects too. So gender studies is not equivalent to women's studies, although it's often treated that way, but men are also gendered subjects. All bodies are gendered subjects. Gender is a concept that's distinct from biological sex. While increasingly it appears that biological sex itself is a construct and not some immutable, unchangeable scientific truth, the construct of gender has more to do with roles than identity, right? Or with, roles rather than sort of biological identity. So that gender is a social construct, whereas biological sex is a scientific construct. The gender binary, so the breaking down of the world into male and female, is, recent studies have suggested, a reductive interpretation of real sexual and biological differentiation, which is complex and multivariant. So, for example, recent studies have suggested that human embryos go through 5 different layers of sexual development in utero. And those layers sort of contribute different sexes to the body. So there's chemicals, hormones, chromosomes, right, and various other layering that determines our sex. And so to reduce biological difference into 2 separate sexes is seen to be probably quite reductive of the real diversity that exists in the human species. And also it has been observed in other species as well. Gender is as a social construct, it's also a social interpretation of observed, experienced, and performed bodies. So we are observing one another, we are experiencing our own lives as gendered subjects, and we're also performing gender throughout our lives. So gendering occurs on various levels of our social existence and our social experience. And gender is therefore also a form of expression and communication. And this is very important in genocide studies, because genocide, we've seen in studies of perpetrators, is a very expressive crime, a very communicative crime. And perpetrators are sending a message, not just to target groups, but to people witnessing the violence, about who they as perpetrators are and what they think their job on this earth is. So, and many of the ways in which perpetrators express their creativity as perpetrators and their creativity in destruction is through gendered performances, and that's something we'll see. And the social communication and interpretation of bodies, right? So all this constructing we do around gender results in what we can call a gender order. And that is a power structure that is defined by gender. So gender infuses all of our aspects of daily collective life, the economy, politics, culture, society, ideology, all of these things are infused with gender constructs, and that is our gender order. In organizing bodies in a gender order, we are constructing reproductive regimes that are the foundation of the social order, including the economy and structures of power. And so, for example, a very common reproductive regime in the West has been the notion of the domestic sphere and the public sphere, which organized reproduction into the private, biological and cultural reproduction into a private space that was the space of women and children, and a public space that was the space of men and politics and high culture. So we see these kinds of binaries in Western societies that are the result of this kind of gendered regime of power that structures all that we do. While bodies produce gender in the objective world, so when you're looking at me, my body is producing my gender, gender itself, so the notion of male and female, and then anything in between or outside of that binary construct is a social construction as well, right? So there is, gender exists. The way that we see each other's gender will have an impact on how we behave and on how people of different gendered bodies experience their lives, their opportunities. It can be both liberating and restrictive as any other social construct. So it's real and it's objective, but it's also still a social construct. So it's infinitely malleable. And therefore, we always are sort of walking that fine line between dealing with a construct and dealing with its real implications for daily life and for the way in which power is organized. Okay, so I know that's confusing, but I hope this becomes more clear as we continue our discussion. Now, when we bring gender into a discussion of genocide, there are three main sort of circles of gender that I want us to consider. So in this diagram, you can see there's sort of a gender regime, or the use of gender and the performance of gender in peacetime society. Gendered patterns within the perpetrator world. So that's kind of the perpetrator's view of gender, their ideological predispositions when it comes to gender, as well as the kind of gender order they hope to create in the world. And then the gender order within victim communities, which in many ways will structure their response to genocide. And genocide itself, as a process, ends up being informed by all of by these three separate gender orders. And therefore, the gendered patterns within genocide are very, very complex when we look at case studies. So another way to put this, and more specific, gender informs the social structures and practices that create the conditions for genocide. So specific gender orders will then inform which social practices, which historical moments are more or less vulnerable to genocide down the road in that society. Gender informs the existential fears that increase vulnerability to genocide. So certain historical moments can create gendered existential fears that then can leave a society vulnerable to committing genocide. A good example of that is that in the literature on the prevention of genocide, one of the greatest vulnerabilities to genocide has been identified as elite groups that feel that their elite status is being undermined. And frequently, these elite groups are understand themselves and are defined as masculine, as dominant groups, um, as groups with highly masculinist traits that, for one reason or another, are losing their position or feel that they are losing their position of power, and blame that loss on another group, which then becomes the target group. So vulnerable elites can be a important triggering mechanism for the choice to commit genocide. And that is often, that experience of vulnerability amongst elites is often a very gendered phenomenon. Gender also informs the timing of the emergence of genocidal ideology. So genocidal ideologies will often emerge in times of great change where elite groups feel that their status is being undermined. Gender informs the shape and content of genocidal ideology. Depending on which genocides you all have studied, I'm sure you will be able to identify those, the gendered shape and content of genocidal ideology. For example, during the Holocaust, Jewish men were defined often as sexually promiscuous and as sexually dangerous to Aryan women. That shares, of course, a logic with white supremacist constructions of Black Americans in the United States. It's actually quite common. In the Rwandan genocide, on the contrary, it was Tutsi women. They were the target of the Hutu power genocide that was committed there. Tutsi women who were seen as sexually promiscuous and sexually dangerous, and they were believed to be working with the UN to tempt Hutu men away from true Hutu power. So, you know, men and women will be constructed differently, and oftentimes one can see the real genocidal dimensions of specific ideologies by looking at how they construct gender and gendered threats. Equally, gender informs the content of genocidal propaganda. So propaganda posters, both from the Holocaust and propagandistic cartoons that were published in Rwanda right before the genocide, focused on the sexual threat of Jewish men on the one hand and of Tutsi women on the other hand. Gender informs the form of genocidal policies. We'll talk a lot about that today. It informs the patterns of genocide. We'll talk about that as well. It informs the experience of genocide. We won't talk about that as much, although I'm hoping we get to that in the discussion of the readings a bit. It informs the responses to genocide from the outside world, from bystanders, and from within the victim communities themselves. And it informs the aftermaths. One of the most enduring consequences of genocide for target communities, right, victim communities, is in fact the way in which the gender order has been rendered, has been harmed through the process of genocide. One of the best examples from a recent case of genocide that I've heard is, for example, the case of the Yazidi in Iraq. Many of you know the Yazidi were targeted with genocide by ISIS, and many Yazidi women, as part of this genocide, were kidnapped and taken as sexual slaves. Now, those who have found freedom from ISIS, who have been rescued, and many, there are still over 3,000 who are still unaccounted for, but those who have been rescued and who have returned to Yazidi communities, which are all now basically in refugee camps, so have returned to these refugee camps with children who were born of genocidal sexual slavery, have been asked by the United Nations to register their children according to Iraqi law, so that their children become recognized beneficiaries of international humanitarian aid. But when you register a child with an unknown father in Iraqi law, that child is registered as Muslim and takes on a Muslim identity. Now, the Yazidis are not Muslim, it's a separate religion. And this has caused problems for the reintegration of children and their mothers into Yazidi society, which does not recognize interfaith marriage and does not recognize the children of interfaith reproduction. So the Yazidi community has had to adapt to that reality, but it's one very good example, I think, of how gender patterns from the genocide can unintentionally be continued after the fact. Another good example is the ostracization of women who are the victims of rape within their home societies after genocide. That ostracization can lead to their complete marginalization from society, and in essence, their loss as members of that cultural group. And so these are ways in which genocide uses gender, in a sense, right? Or gender is, I think, often intentionally implemented by the perpetrators of genocide to commit long-term harm against the target groups. Now, there's a lot of gender research in genocide studies began with the study of the Holocaust. It's really the result of second wave feminist scholarship in women's studies, which was taken up by Holocaust scholars. And in the 70s and 80s, you saw this sudden writing about women's experiences during the Holocaust, particularly as victims. And now we have increasingly very good studies of women's experiences as perpetrators, non-Jewish German women's experiences as perpetrators of the Holocaust, which have shown that female perpetration is incredibly important during times of genocide. And so it's basically only been since the 1980s that gender has been looked at with any seriousness within genocide studies. And it's only in the 2000s that, that the study of gender in the Holocaust sort of was taken up by genocide scholars themselves. There are many scholars who spearheaded this effort. Some were men and some were women within genocide studies. Some of the most important names are Catherine McKinnon, Helen Fine, Adam Jones, Roger Smith. There's a series of scholars who have done the important legwork in recognizing gender as an important aspect of genocide. And since there have been case studies, not so much comparative studies, but now case studies drilling down a bit into what gender actually means for our scholarship on genocide. And what all this scholarship has shown is that using a gendered lens can expose a great deal that we didn't see beforehand about the process of genocide. One is the ubiquity of rape and sexualized violence. It was long thought that during the Holocaust, rape was rare. Rape of Jewish women was rare because the Nazi Party and the Third Reich, the state, had laws against it. They had laws against race mixing, which applied also to rape. But rape was, in fact, scholarship has now shown very common. It was often intentional. While it may not have been used quite in the same way as a weapon of genocide as it was in the Bosnian genocide, it was prolific, particularly in Eastern Europe, in Nazi-occupied Eastern Europe. So it was a common feature in the camps, but also before that at the sites of mass graves during the period of what's been called the Holocaust by bullets, when 1.5 million Jews were killed through mass executions. This sexualization of power we see across all genocides. I have not been made aware of one case of genocide or even potential case of genocide that was not rife with rape and sexualized violence. My own work has focused on life force atrocities as a common feature of genocides across time and space and cultures. And these include inversion rituals and ritual desecrations, so certain types of rituals that perpetrators use to undermine the sort of major components that account for group life. So the relationships of community and family that account for group life. And an example of inversion rituals or ritual desecrations include forcing family members to commit violence, including rape against one another, or raping, for example, the children of important religious and cultural figures in public spaces for all to see. These are types of crimes that target the target group and its identity, right, through the bodies of individual members by inverting proper hierarchies and relations of love and commitment, loyalty, and responsibility between community and family members. The separation of families is another example of life force atrocity, where the target is the individual people, but also those relationships that account for, you know, what perpetrators see as the life force, that thing that explains the existence of this group they wish to eliminate. Gender-based violence against reproduction, such as targeting men and women, boys and girls, according to their gender and place within the larger reproductive system. Examples of those sorts of life force atrocities include, for example, cruelties committed against infants, both male and female, as symbols of the future of the group. Cruelties committed against men specifically as fathers, right? So killing an entire family while a father is forced to watch before he is killed as the patriarch is a form of gender-based life force atrocity. And then the destruction of entire families. Frequently perpetrators each individual perpetrator or small unit, killing unit, does not address the target group in its entirety. And so genocide, you know, as we've seen, is played out in a host of smaller ways that are often very close and very intimate in the way they play out. And a frequent indicator of genocide, and a pattern we see in all genocides, is the destruction of all generations within one family, where that family becomes sort of the stand-in for the entire group. And the perpetrators can feel they have committed total genocide simply by wiping out an entire family, including pregnant members, so the unborn and the very, very old. Alongside this destruction of entire families, you often have destruction of all cultural symbols of that family or that community's existence. So, for example, the destruction not just of the unborn and the very, very old, but even of those who have passed through the desecration of cemeteries, for example. That's a very, very common form of life force atrocity during genocide. A gendered lens has also exposed intentionally gendered patterns of destruction. So this includes, for example, sex selective massacre. A good example of that is the massacre in Srebrenica in 1995 of Bosniak men and boys, as well as the pattern of killing men and raping and enslaving women. So the classic genocides, what are often seen as the classic genocides of the 20th century, the Armenian genocide, the Holocaust, and the 1994 genocide against Rwandan Tutsis, all involved sex-selective tortures alongside sort of global massacre of both or all sexes. So there was sex-selective torture within a larger framework of totalizing murder. But the most common form of genocide in history is, in fact, this massacre of men, direct massacre of men, and the raping and enslaving of women. So men and boys on the one hand, women and girls on the other. Of course, men and boys will be raped and enslaved. Women and girls will be killed and sometimes massacred as well. But in the aggregate, the most common form of genocide is this process that really separates out the way in which people are targeted by gender. And so that's what we see, and we see it today. This was the case amongst the Yazidi, it's the case within the Rohingya. So we see this pattern of killing of men, raping, enslaving of women, even today, and it's the most common pattern. But it was the gendered lens that really exposed that as a form of genocide and not simply of massacre. A gendered lens has also exposed the intentional destruction of the social fabric of the group, right? As well as the removal of target peoples and target groups from the social fabric of the larger group. in which both perpetrators and victims exist, right? And it was two women scholars that called attention to this. Helen Fine called attention to the removal of groups from the community of moral obligation, right? And it was the philosopher Claudia Card who called attention to the notion of social death as one of the cornerstones of genocide. The idea that the harm that perpetrators are trying to commit is not simply the killing of bodies, but the destruction of the social life, the social fabric, and the inclusion of targeted individuals and targeted groups within the wider sort of social fabric of humanity. And she argued that it's that social death that is one of the most harmful and long-lasting consequences of genocide. And a gendered lens has also shown us that perpetrators betray really an obsession with reproduction, understood both culturally and physically. So when you study perpetrator ideology, perpetrator culture, perpetrator practice, perpetrator policy, speech acts, you often see and hear very, very gendered obsessions with reproduction within their own group and and obsessions with what they consider to be reproductive patterns within the targeted group. And we're going to look at that a little bit today as well. So that's all very abstract. We can get a little bit more concrete now. I want to call attention to the only definition in the last 30 years of genocide that I'm aware of that includes very gendered language. So most definitions of genocide outside of the legal definition tend to define genocide as primarily a form of mass murder against specific groups is the definition. Helen Fine, back in 1993 already, was looking at genocide more as an assault on reproduction. So she defined genocide as a sustained purposeful action by a perpetrator to physically destroy a collectivity directly or indirectly through interdiction of the biological and social reproduction of group members, sustained regardless of the surrender or lack of threat offered by the victim. We can talk about all the other elements of that definition, which is very complex, but I want to call your attention to the fact that she does mention there the interdiction of biological and social reproduction as an important factor within a definition of genocide. And I think her insights have really been borne out by subsequent research, and yet she rarely gets the kind of, I think, credit that she deserves for spearheading that kind of approach. Now, my current work is on genocide as a form of reproductive violence. So I've taken Helen Fine's definition and decided to look at genocide beneath a larger category, which is reproductive violence, right? So when we look at genocide as a form of reproductive violence, what do we see? And some of the things I've seen in all cases of genocide are a series of patterns that can be identified as reproductive violence, and on their own do exist outside of genocide as forms of reproductive violence. And so you will frequently see states or parties or armed forces taking on the parental role. This was the case in the Cambodian genocide, where the Khmer Rouge defined itself as the parent, the mom and dad of all Cambodians, right? And dissolved family structures and made families illegal. It was also the case in Argentina, where the military junta declared itself to be the parent of the nation, right? That could dispose of its various members as it wished, and used that very gendered language of mostly fatherhood in describing their role. In genocidal societies, we frequently see marriage bans, either marriage bans that apply to the targeted groups, members within the targeted groups, or marriage bans that apply to people coming from perpetrator and targeted groups between those two. You can also see forced marriages. That was when the Khmer Rouge dissolved families. They then reconstructed them, forcing certain people to marry one another in the name of creating sort of revolutionary babies who would be loyal to the revolution and would continue the goals of the revolution. You see dissolution of families. You see coercive family creation. So people being forced to not just marry, but to create families and care for babies from other groups who are candidates for assimilation. You see the refusal to recognize families. So frequently within genocidal ideology, target groups will be defined as people incapable of forming families for whatever reason. This was the case during US slavery. We're going to discuss that in a moment. You'll see pro-natalist policies on the part of perpetrators for their group. So, you know, the encouragement of reproduction within certain groups, and then anti-natalist policies targeting other groups. So the disencouragement of reproduction amongst other groups. This can take the form of forced abortions within target groups, as well as the banning of abortions within pro-natalist groups. So one of the problems that people face when they suggest that abortion itself is a form of genocide is that very argument and the attempt to regulate reproductive practices within women is a common feature of genocidal regimes. So this is a tension within that argument. Child abduction, right? So the undermining of families through abducting children or by forcing children through state initiative to be trained and educated within state schools or state organizations. So one example is the boarding school system in former British settler colonies. Another is the Hitler Youth, for example, right? So at times this kind of child abduction takes place frequently, in fact, against targeted groups, right? But it can also take place within perpetrator groups when perpetrators wish to undermine the power of families largely to resist within perpetrator groups by claiming the children and indoctrinating children. Sexual slavery is another form of reproductive violence that is extremely common during genocides. It can be long lasting, as we see with the Yazidi, who many women have now been sexually enslaved by ISIS members since 2014. This was also the case, of course, during the Armenian genocide, where many Armenian women were sexually enslaved instead of being killed. And then for various reasons, were not able or chose not to leave their new families after the genocide, largely because they would have to leave their children behind, or they had no way of sustaining themselves on their own. Life force atrocities against symbols of collective generation. So a form of reproductive violence that is also a life force atrocity that I've identified in most cases of genocide is the evisceration of pregnant women. For example, genocidaires commit this act over and over and over again across cultures and across time. So I think that looking at genocide as a form of reproductive violence has the effect of surfacing kinds of practices that aren't often considered to be part of genocide and yet have been really critical aspects of perpetrator intent, as well as perpetrator policies and perpetrator implementation of genocidal strategies. Okay, oh, let me see. Okay. One insight I think that gendered study of genocide, and particularly looking at reproductive violence, can give us is that genocide need not always include killing. So most of the genocides we know of involved mass murder of some sort. But there are cases that are increasingly being understood as cases of genocide that didn't involve mass murder, at least for certain durable periods of the process. And a very good example of that are the so-called stolen generations in Australia. And these are Aboriginal children who were taken from their families, put into boarding schools, and never allowed to have contact with their Aboriginal families again through their lives. This policy came after a policy of massacre, expropriation, and concentration on reserves used against the Aboriginal population. So this is a sort of genocide that can happen after what we would consider a more classic colonial genocidal stage or settler colonial genocidal form that does have built into it a significant amount of direct physical killing. What it involved was the removal of children who were considered to be half-blood. That is, so not all children were removed from Aboriginal families. Most of the ones who were removed were those who were considered to have some, this is all ridiculous, but some white blood within them, largely because their fathers were white laborers near or on Aboriginal reservations who had formed families or at least produced offspring with Aboriginal women. These children were taken as part of what became in Australia in the 1930s a selective breeding scheme in which and that's the photo you see here, in which the oldest woman there is considered to be the half-blood. And this diagram is supposed to show us how you could slowly breed out the color of the Aborigines in the name of creating a white Australia. And so the octoroon grandson, and these are the ridiculous terms that come out of race science and racialism, Western racialism, but the octoroon grandson is considered to be more white than the half-blood grandmother. And the plan in creating this white Australia was to completely eliminate the Aboriginal presence. And the way that was supposed to work was that while these half-blood children were being taken, the racist belief was that full-blooded Aborigines, because they were considered to be primitive, that they would slowly die out as a natural consequence of their interaction with modernity. So they were believed to be a doomed race that was slowly dying out. And the idea was if you took their children that still had some white blood, which might, if left within Aboriginal circles, might lead to a kind of resurgence of Aboriginal abilities in the world, right? And a continuation of Aboriginal life. If you remove that white blood from the Aborigines, the full-blooded Aborigines will die, and the Aboriginal blood that still exists in the half-breeds or the half-blooded Aborigines can be bred out. So this is a scheme where the goal was total genocide, and yet it involved immense cruelty and certainly reproductive violence and life force atrocities, but it did not involve actual killing. Oops. Another example in the United States is today's foster care system. So an example I'm going to give, and I have in the PowerPoint, which certainly everyone can have a copy of, a very nice 13-minute video, which we don't have time to show, about the child removal within South Dakota, and particularly amongst the Lakota peoples, which you can watch at some other time. But in general, what's important here is that the Lakota people in the United States have charged the United States, not officially, but in their own publications and in their own work and their own political work with continuing genocidal practices through the use of child removal. Now, the state of South Dakota has become dependent financially on removing removing Native children and placing them in non-Native homes. They receive a lot of money from the federal government for each child they place. And so in a sense, it's caught in this removal strategy, but the removals are in contravention of existing law in the United States, law that was created to undo decades of genocidal boarding school practices within the American government when it came to Native Americans. So the Lakota now have argued that child removal, foster care, something that is seen to be in the interests of children and families, that is seen to be a moral good, is itself both the consequence of and the continuation of genocidal practices from the 19th and early 20th centuries. And if you look at the overall impact of these child removals on Lakota families and on Lakota society and on the social fabric, that the genocide, the claim of genocide becomes very convincing. Okay. So in a gender analysis, we see several things that have now become quite accepted within genocide scholarship, within genocide studies. And that is that genocide is a system of practices and a process rather than an event. We can identify certain events and we often name them, like the Holocaust, right? But there is so much that goes into the creation of an event of mass murder that is still itself genocidal and is part of the genocide. So rather than seeing genocide only as an event, increasingly scholars are seeing it as a process and a system of practices that sometimes result in mass murder. So mass murder becomes a form or a stage of genocide rather than the only indicator or even the main indicator of genocide. Also, genocide is not as extraordinary as is often thought. If we define genocide as mass murder, it looks very extraordinary. Luckily, cases of mass murder are not all that common, although once you start looking at them, they do seem rather common enough. But genocidal practices we can see in peacetime societies all over the place, even when they haven't come together to create a process that we may then determine is genocidal in and of itself. So there are genocidal practices and techniques and logics all around us in everyday life. One of the best books pointing this out is a book called Sex and World Peace, which has been written by international relations scholars and is very much a statistical analysis of gender-based violence and gender-based inequalities that shows that from the moment of sort of the creation of families, certain kinds of gender violence can increase a society's propensity to participate in war, right? Its propensity to participate in conflict and to commit genocide. So they link genocide and war and conflict to the everyday practices of gendered existence in peacetime societies. It's an excellent study of how we might do that. And so we see that it's not, genocide is not as extraordinary, unfortunately, as is often thought. It can be committed without mass killing. It is linked to the intimate practices of everyday life. Perpetrators instrumentalize our deepest relationships, loyalties, bonds, and responsibilities to destroy not just our bodies, right, or victim bodies, but the spirit of the group, the history of the group, the dynamism of the group, that which accounts for a group's vitality and its ability to reproduce itself powerfully in history over time. Genocide also has no clear beginning and no clear end. It's hard once you start looking at gendered patterns to decide when did this actually start and when did it end. You know, genocide emerges from structure and practice. During genocide, crimes are committed that one of my students, a master's student, Ashley Chacon, has called crimes of perpetual consequence, including rape, for example, where it never ends, right? Not just the mental or emotional sequelae of rape, but also physical and social. So you have these crimes that continue into peacetime and that are never really left behind the individual and the group affected. You see an uptick in sexual and domestic violence after genocide within target groups and within perpetrator groups. So for women, whereas armed conflict may end, genocidal practices can continue within both groups and between groups. You see an endurance of genocidal policies and social forms. I gave the Yazidi example and the need to register children and then the problem of identity that causes. And you see a long-term heightened vulnerability to genocide. So one of the key features of societies that are vulnerable to genocide is that they've had a genocide or a genocide-like event and process in the past. And I think modern Turkey is a very good example of that, where genocides against the Armenians and genocidal practices towards Kurds have sort of continued to the present day and are crossing borders now into northern Syria. And the language spoken today is reminiscent of and echoes language from the Armenian genocide. So there's just an enduring quality to genocidal processes, practices, thought patterns, belief systems, relationships between people, that if a society doesn't address and account for afterwards, and really work, as Germany, for example, worked not perfectly, but a bit after the Holocaust, because it was forced to after the Holocaust. If a society doesn't commit to some form of accountability, those patterns will continue. And that's one thing I do think we should talk about as existing still in the United States, a country that has not at all really accounted for its genocidal history. And some of the strongest early warning indicators of genocide are, in fact, these gendered ideologies, gendered concepts, and gendered atrocities, because it's through an articulation of the sense that a perpetrator group is being undermined, or its dynamism, its generative capacity threatened by other groups. It's that existential sense of threat that is one of the most common elements within genocidal ideology. And the reproductive realm seems to be a space in which our species experiences that sort of existential threat in a very particular and violent way. Now, what's interesting about the study of gender and genocide is that Raphael Lemkin, the father of the Genocide Convention, the man who coined the term genocide and articulated its original definition in his book, Axis Rule in Occupied Europe, that was published in 1944, he focused on gender patterns and even on sexualized violence. So I call him kind of the earliest gender scholar, right? He was writing even before Simone de Beauvoir published The Second Sex. So he didn't know he was studying gender, but he was. And so he mentions, you could see examples here from the dossier on the Armenian genocide. He mentions sexualized violence against men, sexualized violence against women. He mentions in his studies of the Mongols, rape and the maltreatment of women. And he mentions things like the torture of babies and small parents, or the forced cannibalism of children by their parents, these sorts of things that I'm calling life force atrocities, right, that are very common across, unfortunately, across cases of genocide. These are in Raphael Lemkin's historical studies. In Axis Rule in Occupied Europe itself, where he was particularly studying Nazi occupation policies across Europe, he mentions many techniques, gendered techniques, that the Nazis were using to commit genocide. And he mentions specifically marriage controls and bans, the criminalization of biological reproduction amongst Jews in particular, the undernourishment of parents, for example, in ghettos, which made it impossible for them to raise children and to continue sort of cultural reproduction through children. And he mentions policies calculated to decrease the birth rate in one group, combined with, and this relation was very important to him, combined with policies aimed at increasing the birth rate in another group. So Raphael Lemkin saw genocide as a relational phenomenon. You remove people from one group and you create more people in another group. And this is how he saw it, which is a very gendered way of looking at genocide. Some of the forms of gendered legislation that he included as forms of genocidal legislation in Axis rule is, for example, an order concerning the granting of child subsidies to Germans in the government general in Poland. You wouldn't expect to see such a law in a book on genocidal policies. How can feeding children within an occupied territory be seen as genocidal? Well, because Raphael Lemkin understood genocide as relational. And if you are feeding one group of children while forcing other groups of children into ghettos where they are starved or into camps where they are starved, then that feeding and the policies behind that feeding and the government subsidies that feed the children, that support that feeding, that is a genocidal policy. I want to mention a quote here from Lemkin that is has been quite ignored in the literature, but I think is very important in understanding the way that he understood genocide. So he wrote in Axis Rule that the enemy nation within the control of Germany, he's talking as a Nazi policymaker, or a Nazi ideologue, the enemy nation within the control of Germany must be destroyed or weakened in different degrees for decades to come. Thus, the German people in the post-war period will be in a position to deal with other European peoples from the vantage point of biological superiority. He was not himself suggesting this was a reality, but he was speaking again as an ideologue. Because the imposition of this policy of genocide is more destructive for a people than injuries suffered in actual fighting, the German people will be stronger than the subjugated peoples after the war, even if the German army is defeated. In this respect, genocide is a new technique of occupation aimed at winning the peace, even though the war itself is lost. This is a very deep quote. And what I hear Lemkin suggesting here is that for genocidaires, the most important thing is this struggle of power, of biological, cultural, social, reproductive power between groups within their own ideological framework. And so they may kill members of the target group to the extent that they feel it's necessary in order to win this biological game. But in the end, what they're trying to do is weaken that group, right? Through a process of destruction and elimination that involves much more than simply mass death. And you guys have probably encountered, perhaps in these webinars or in your own studies, his various other ways of defining genocide as the removal kind of the targeted group's national identity, and the imposition of the perpetrator group's national identity. So there are different ways and different points in the book. He uses different language and different schemas to define genocide. But this is one that we don't look at enough, which is this relational idea within genocidal ideology, which simply is about weakening one group and strengthening another, such that the perpetrator group that's being strengthened feels that it has come out on top and has sustained and can sustain that power over the next decades. And that brings us to the question of American slavery. I think we see in Lemkin's sort of voicing of Nazi ideology there, this notion of relational strength and weakness that echoes white supremacist ideology in the United States. And some of you may know that there are several studies that have come out in the last 10 years that have shown the dramatic influence that US settler colonialism, US anti-Black racism, and Jim Crow and US eugenics has had on the early articulation of Nazi ideology, as well as the policies that Nazis imposed on Germany after 1933. And if you go back in history, you can see the American influence, particularly the influence of the Americas writ large, North and South America, the influence of colonial policies in the Americas on early race thinkers in Europe, and especially within the radical racialist right wing of German politics that existed even before World War I. So the US contribution to German thinking on and Nazi thinking about occupation policy, about religious and ethnic and national minority groups, about anti-Semitism particularly, has been quite intense. And it's something that I think in genocide studies we're going to be grappling with for decades to come, right? What are the real implications of this new research on our definitions and understanding of genocide? Now, the dominant scholar, however, right, the implications I think have not yet been appreciated within the dominant scholarship in genocide studies, including within my own scholarship. Now, dominant scholarship has tended to compare US slavery with the Holocaust, right? So in determining whether or not US slavery, for example, and that's not to talk about anti-Black racism, more broadly, but in determining whether US slavery is a case of genocide, scholars have chosen the most extreme case of genocide, the most comprehensive case of genocide, probably in human history, the Holocaust, as the sort of touchstone. And this, of course, sets up a dichotomy between exploitation, which is the general definition of US slavery, versus extermination, which is what was happening during the Holocaust. Dominant scholarship tends to emphasize the value of Black slave labor in the United States, where, for example, on many plantations, there were policies of pronatalism because slave owners wanted to create a self-sustaining slave population, particularly after the slave trade was banned in 1807 in England and in 1808 in the United States. So you could no longer legally acquire slaves from abroad and needed to create a self-sustaining slave population at home. And so if it were a case of genocide, the logic is you wouldn't have a policy of pronatalism, right, which encourages the reproduction of people. Although we'll talk about whether it encourages the reproduction of a group, and if it's a group, what group exactly is being reproduced. And then dominant scholarship of genocide studies has emphasized Black resilience and successful resistance to plantation slavery's efforts to undermine them as families and communities and larger identity groups, which in a sense lets the state off the hook for genocide by focusing on the successes and the strengths of the potential victims of genocide. So this is where the scholarship is today within dominant scholarship on slavery. However, there is another tendency within, not within the formal sort of understanding of genocide studies, but within the study of genocide, which comes out of the Black intellectual radical tradition. And I think that we can say that that tradition has been largely ignored by US scholars in particular, but by genocide scholars around the world in general as well. So you read parts of We Charge Genocide, which was a petition to the United Nations by African Americans, right, and African American civil rights activists who in 1951 decided that it was time to use this newly minted Genocide Convention, right, to help explain the plight of African Americans in the United States. And their petition largely focused on, we'll talk about this in a moment, but focused on the post-war period in the United States and the sorts of deprivations and iniquities that African Americans were experiencing then, but it resonated with the long-term history of the Black American experience. And here is does anyone know who that is? Let me go back. Is anyone raising their hand, Megan?
No.
No? Okay.
Hands? Oh, there. Oh, Joyce had her hand up.
Oh, great.
Joyce, can you unmute your
I think it's Paul Robeson. Is that wrong?
No, that's correct.
Oh, okay, good.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is a picture of
Great.
Paul
Okay.
Robeson, awesome, Joyce, presenting We Charge Genocide in New York City to the UN Secretariat. He was going to, the editor of We Charge Genocide was a African-American lawyer named William Patterson, and Paul Robeson was going to accompany him to Paris to present this to a United Nations meeting there in 1951, but was not allowed by the US State Department to travel overseas for this purpose. W.E.B. Du Bois, the African-American intellectual, was also not allowed to travel for that purpose, and so he stayed in the United States. And then William Patterson, when he came back from Paris, was deprived of his passport and prevented from traveling internationally as a consequence of bringing We Charge Genocide to the United Nations until 1958, when, and I want to get the name, pardon me, when the Internal Security Act of 1950 was overturned by the US Supreme Court. So between 1950 and 1958, people could have their passports revoked for what was considered un-American political activity. Now, why was Paul Robeson, why were he and William Patterson seen to be engaging in un-American activity by bringing We Charge Genocide to the United Nations? Apart from the fact that they were charging the US with genocide, they were also members of the US Communist Party. And so this original articulation of a charge of genocide against the United States for anti-Black racism is mixed up in the very complicated history of anti-communism and the Cold War. Now, We Charge Genocide focused on several patterns, patterns of violence. So it was a study of patterns. And those patterns included lynching, police brutality, the eliminationist ideology of the KKK that at that point was often heard in the halls of Congress and local state houses as well. Incitement, the crime of incitement, the crime of conspiracy, economic conditions, so patterns of economic conditions, patterns of the denial of the right to vote, and the mental harm that all of these things caused for Black Americans. And they, in a sense, although not explicitly, they organized all of this material underneath the rubric of the concept of genocide for profit. And what I find so interesting, now naturally that comes out of a kind of Marxist interpretation of history, but it also, in a sense, is the forerunner to contemporary notions of the genocidal society. So Tony Barta's work on Australia, or structural genocide, approaches to structural genocide, which has emerged from many indigenous scholars and indigenous groups. The notion of genocide as social practice, Daniel Firestein's concept, echoes of all of these more contemporary articulations of this idea are already in We Charge Genocide. So it's a pity that on its own merits, this petition has not been taken more seriously by intellectuals, and particularly white intellectuals in the United States. Now, it has, however, had a large impact on the thinking of African-American intellectuals and African-American political movements. And as that, it's part of a tradition of post-World War II petitions by Black Americans to the United Nations that I would think most white scholars and students of genocide don't know about. So, for example, as I've been researching this, I was surprised that you could see a series of petitions here that I have listed that you know, continue up to the present day, June 8th, 2020, when 4 family members of men killed by, or men and women killed, Black men and women killed by police in the United States, submitted a letter to the United Nations Human Rights Council, along with 600 rights groups from around the world, asking the UN to look into police brutality in the United States. In 1914, I wrote 1914, I'm so sorry. In 2014, young activists in Chicago submitted a report to the UN about police brutality in Chicago called We Charge Genocide, that explicitly referenced the original petition from 1951. And the original petition from 1951 followed on the heels of 2 petitions, one of which was submitted by W.E.B. Du Bois himself, who was then involved in We Charge Genocide. So this was not, there's really no way, particularly in retrospect, to look at We Charge Genocide as a scurrilous and politically motivated, or solely politically motivated petition. It's a petition that comes out of the very organic experience of African Americans and their intellectual energy in defining the type, in searching for definitions of the horrors that they had historically were experiencing then in 1951 and still experience today. So the term genocide has been used within African American scholarship and within the African American community. It's just, unfortunately, for various reasons, been largely ignored by dominant scholarship. Lemkin, now one of the reasons this is the case is that Lemkin himself, although, now we just talked about how Lemkin looked at gender as an element, an important element within the genocidal process, and understood relational forms of relational practices as potentially genocidal based on those gender norms, and how this may have, in a sense, set the stage for him to understand, or at least intellectually perhaps even agree with, right, the charges made in We Charge Genocide, but he was vociferous in his rejection of the charges in We Charge Genocide. He stated in an op-ed in the New York Times that the accusations were a maneuver to divert attention from the Soviet crimes of genocide committed against Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians, Poles, and other Soviet subjugated peoples. He called Robeson and Pattison un-American elements serving a foreign power, and suggested the Blacks were not experiencing the destruction, death, and annihilation that would qualify their experience as genocide. Now, there are different ways in which his resistance to We Charge Genocide has been interpreted, including, for example, the fact that he found safe haven, like so many Jewish refugees from Nazi-occupied Europe, in the United States, that he himself had just lost 49 members of his family to the Holocaust, and because of that totalizing quality of his loss, would be less inclined to see the more stochastic form of violence committed against African Americans as a, as coming together within a genocidal process. And also he was extremely concerned about getting the Genocide Convention accepted and ratified by as many states internationally as possible, and therefore was caught up in the politics of the Cold War in a way that he felt perhaps pressured to reject We Charge Genocide, which embarrassed the United States internationally and led to great criticisms, particularly within the Soviet bloc, against the United States, or criticisms of the United States. So Lemkin's response has to be seen within the larger framework of the Cold War. And he was also, as were many, many refugees from both Nazi and Soviet occupied Eastern Europe, profoundly anti-communist because he had experienced the horrors of Soviet mass murder, Soviet genocide, and Stalinism. Now, if we look, however, at the kind of practices and policies of both expansionism, so settler colonialism in the United States, and slavery, plantation slavery, we can begin to see echoes, I would submit, of genocidal practices in cases that are seen as classic cases of genocide, or they're more accepted as genocide. Of course, the genocide of Native Americans is widely accepted as a case of genocide outside of the United States, but it still is seen as a complicated case, a controversial case in many ways. What we see, however, in terms of practices and institutions emerging from that is this concept of manifest destiny, which is an eliminationist ideology, which continues today in the notion of American exceptionalism, the denial of sovereignty of organized groups, massacres, expropriations, relocations, and reservations as a form of population policy, widespread rape and sexualized violence that continues up to the present day against Native women, the denial of identity, which continues up to the present day, but was at its height perhaps in the boarding school movement, family separation, both during the boarding school period and now in the foster care system, which has taken the place of the boarding school system, forced sterilizations, which continued into the 1970s, and today you still hear every once in a while cases that are believed to be coercive sterilizations of Native women. And what Andrea Smith, who you read, called not internationalization, internalization of the genocidal project, whereby years and years and years of consistent genocidal policies become internalized by the group themselves, such as the group continues committing genocide against itself. And we see that even in shorter terms within the Yazidi community as well. You could see that problem, and then efforts now, because the world is much more aware of genocide, efforts by Yazidi leaders to counteract that possible internalization of the genocidal project. Now, if we look at genocidal or potentially genocidal practices of anti-Black racism, which is an ideology that was forged through hundreds of years of plantation slavery in the United States, we see similar patterns. The emergence of an ideology of white supremacy, which is not itself eliminationist, but is in a sense the creation of a caste system of owners and laborers, right, defined by race, masters and slaves. A form of racist ideology that we could still see the logic of informing present day practices amongst white Americans. The denial of identity. So, for example, the forcible separation of language groups upon arrival into the United States for fear that the motive was to reduce the chances of resistance because language, of course, facilitates communication. So scattering nations and scattering language groups is a way to do that. But it is also a form of the denial of identity, which means the denial of a strong historical collective. And then this denial of identity continued upon arrival in the United States, where new Black slaves were not allowed to create consistent and strong community and family ties. So groups were undermined as soon as they sort of came into formation. That has been explained with reference to this motive to avoid resistance. And of course, that's part of it, but we know in genocide studies, intent and motive are two separate things, and it's important to try and keep them distinct. The denial of family life, which is part of this denial of identity and denial of family. So slave parents had no claim to children, and as long as slave parents were living with their children, those children were often sent to labor on other farms and plantations. Their location was controlled by the masters. The mothers were forced to live, for example, in the main house and had very little time with her children. And as we know, families were separated on the auction block, the horrific auction block. Families were also traded off, so they may not have been sold, but they were traded out to different masters. Families were left to different family members in the wills left by masters after they died. And then families were farmed out for seasonal work, so even if they were able to collect at certain times on certain plantations, they often didn't have much time together. The denial of sovereignty, so this inability of slaves to create lasting groups, whether as family units, right, or as larger collectivities. The denial of childhood, so the focusing in on children, it's a problem we still see now in US treatment of Black Americans. The denigration of Black motherhood, this idea that Black mothers were not good mothers, were not able to be good mothers, were somehow racially incapable of mothering or forming families, that Black women were sexually promiscuous and therefore incapable of forming lasting family ties, et cetera, et cetera. Similarly, on the other side, the sexualization and criminalization of Black fathers, out of which this racist trope emerged, then the racist trope of the Black rapist, which then accounted for, some scholars think, between 25 and 30% of all lynchings that occurred once slavery was made illegal. Rape and sexualized violence, as we know, was common on plantations. Masters owned the bodies of their slaves in all ways that can be understood. It was just simply a form of domination. Lynching, massacre, and forced sterilizations were all part of the plantation complex, but then also were some of the lasting qualities and techniques of domination that existed past the end of slavery. So lynching, as we know, was one of the principal ways of disciplining Black Americans and keeping them in fear after Reconstruction and through Jim Crow. Massacre was another way of approaching Black communities that were either flourishing or resisting white supremacy in one way or another. We've heard a lot about the Tulsa massacre, but there were several such massacres after World War I alone in the United States, where hundreds of African Americans, dozens and hundreds of African Americans were killed, and many expropriated, right, and forced to move. And then forced sterilizations, which you read about briefly in this small kind of chapter from the book Killing the Black Body, which lasted up, like with Native American women, up to the 1970s. And so I'm going to end now. You've read more about these things, but I want to suggest some possibilities for what a colleague of mine named Al Frankowski has called, not in any published form yet, the American form of genocide. And actually I meant to put him on this slide, and I will before I send it out to everybody. But he's thought a great deal about, he's an African-American scholar at the University of Illinois, and he's thought a great deal about these issues. And he thinks one of the problems we face as genocide scholars is that we keep comparing the United States to other places. Whereas we don't do that, for example, with the Holocaust. We're not comparing the Holocaust to the Herero genocide to see, right? And so but we don't simply compare the United States to the Holocaust, which, you know, was the norm for so long in genocide studies, since the Holocaust is in a sense the most comprehensive genocide, and certainly was the case of genocide, not only led Raphael Lemkin to coin the term, but also became sort of the standard bearer when genocide studies emerged as its own field of study. We don't simply compare the US to that. We compare it to the Rwandan genocide. We compare the US case of genocide to the Australian case of genocide. Rarely are we talking about the American form of genocide. So sort of a practice, a process, a form that emerged out of the American experience and out of American history. So he's increasingly pushing for us to begin to conceptualize an American form that looks at indigenous genocide in the United States alongside plantation slavery and other techniques of domination and control, to sort of understand a genealogy of power and white supremacy as it has emerged over time. And so some of the possibilities I think emerge from this project is that genocide is a form of reproductive violence. It's a form of interference in the reproduction of identity. And different cultures, different perpetrators from different cultures will understand how they're going to do that differently. They'll plan differently, but they're really looking at reproduction. They don't want this group. Perhaps that requires killing every member of the group, but rarely in history has that been the case, either because perpetrators don't have access to all members of the group, or because they think this in part of the, right, which was incorporated into the legal definition, but in part, they think that in part aspect of genocide will, you know, suffice to ensure their continued domination and power. And the American form, I think, also suggests that there's, you know, a kind of tension between the destruction of old identities. So, for example, in the case of anti-Black racism, that includes the destruction of African nationalities, similar to the destruction of Native American sovereign rights in the United States, African nationalities once they got here. So there's a tension between destroying old identities, or in the Holocaust, the destruction of, you know, hundreds of year old shtetl communities, thousands of year old communities in Eastern Europe, those old identities, and the obstruction of the creation of new identities. And I think Black Americans straddle those two processes. And so our understanding of genocide against Black Americans is in tension with these two different forms, where one is the destruction of well-established identities, language groups, religions, however you want to define that group. And the other is the creation, the tamping down on the emergence of new identities. And I have an excellent student, Haley Brown, who has written a now published article, which I'll also put at the bottom here, about how the world over, and particularly in the US, this effort now to tamp down on the emergence of this new identity of transgendered people, right, can be seen as a genocidal practice, and often expresses itself with the same cruelty as many genocidal rituals, because it is an attempt to eliminate an identity before it even forms. And I think we saw something similar happening in the US plantation system, where people were not allowed to form stable families, where community groups were ripped apart as soon as they seemed to function as community groups, which included resistance oftentimes. So that can be built into a system. And I think the Black experience straddles both of these forms. Another is that we look at white supremacy as a form of democratic genocide and stochastic genocide, where the intent is not in a short period contained within a state or a party or the leadership of an armed group, but is sort of refracted, right? It's dispersed across individuals who are acting as representatives of this larger ideological framework and the logic of domination that it informs. And so lynchings, for example, are hard to understand as genocide if we're looking for a president of the United States ordering police and judges and community members to kill Black men, for example. That we won't find. But one does find a pattern where these sorts of terrorizations of African Americans that do immense harm, not just to the person lynched, but their family and their entire community and the nationwide Black community, we find that these smaller scale rituals of destruction are then tolerated and allowed to occur with impunity and sanctified, and often both celebrated and then ignored in dominant language in a way that does not allow the full horror to be adequately appreciated by the American public. And I know that harkens to me to the summer we just had in the US, where it is as if many Americans woke up suddenly to the real horror that African Americans have been experiencing in this country since its founding, because of this 8-minute video that just is destroying of anyone who watches it, who has a conscience, of George Floyd being killed by police in Minnesota. So it took that. And so these moments of recognition, but our language is such, our dominant language is such that it also hides that form of violence. And then we do see, however, in other quarters, it being celebrated still today. Also, I think that an American form of genocide suggests that, genocide has a mutability. Over time, genocidal practices, if they're not identified and not accounted for and not worked on, they can mutate. And so this we see, for example, in the language of Black Lives Matter, that in some cases we'll talk about mass incarceration as a form of genocide. And I actually know a scholar named Elisa who works on mass incarceration as a form of genocide. And, there are arguments to be made for that in the way it leads to an increased death rate, it prevents births, it separates families, et cetera, et cetera. The difficulty people have is that people who are mass incarcerated are convicted of a crime. And no matter how many innocent people are convicted of a crime, that kind of criminality behind the category of person that is in the prison system reduces public ability to recognize them as potential victims of genocide. It just bears pointing out, and this is Elisa work, that most groups targeted for genocide are criminalized before they're targeted for genocide. And there are interesting ways in which that happens. For example, outside of even Nazi ideology, many early concentration camps in Germany were converted prisons. So when I lived in Germany for a while, I lived near the concentration camp of Neuengamme in northern Germany, outside of Hamburg. And, several people that I talked to there about living through the Third Reich, non-Jewish Germans, farmers who lived near it, told me that, it was hard because originally the persons incarcerated were criminal elements, right? Thieves, right? People convicted of crimes. And they were often marched through the little town and through the rural roads to go do some work that they were forced labor. And so this sort of slipped easily into new types of inmates right? And you know, and they recognized the distinction, but it stuck out to me, the fact that you know, this criminality just followed whoever ended up in that place was conceived of having done something wrong by virtue of the fact that they were there. So criminality is one of the ways in which genocide is justified. So we have to remember that when looking at the question of mass incarceration. Also, genocide, you know, there's an adaptability of genocidal practice. So for example, you know, here I'm making a kind of normative claim, but President Trump's decision to separate families and put them in separate detention facilities was not news to Black Americans or Native Americans who had experienced similar separations and who immediately made the connection between that technique used against them and the technique now being sort of externalized and used against another group, right? This idea of undocumented immigrants. And it suggests that, you know, accountability in the US in particular, but really worldwide, accountability for genocide will need, because of the reproductive aspects of this, we'll need to focus on reproductive justice, which includes things like reproductive sovereignty. You saw that in Dorothy Roberts killing the Black body. This is a concern of hers, you know, that the use of the term genocide does not somehow create a false pronatalism where Black women do not have control over their own reproduction and they cannot exercise reproductive sovereignty. But reproductive sovereignty can also be understood as sort of community sovereignty, national sovereignty, group sovereignty. So the exercise of the community over the disposal of its resources and of its bodies and of its children and of its members. Family rights, community sovereignty, all of these things need to be a part of accountability for genocide, in addition to, right, the many ways in which we've talked about accountability up to this point. But this focus on reproductive justice, I think the American form of genocide really points out how important that's going to be to accountability. Okay, so I want to end there and take questions or comments.
Yes. Okay, so I'll open up the Q&A here. So Margarita says, rape is common in all genocides, as you said. I just want to understand, did rape refer only to women or men too? Is rape a way to show dominance or what? So that was part one of her question.
Yeah, okay.
Did you want me to continue with the second part?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is it related to the first part?
I think it's different, actually. It's the
okay. So let's. Yeah. So is rape the question? The first question is then sort of, is rape a form of dominance? Yes. So rape is a form of, it's about power and it's a form of dominance. When it's used in genocide, I see it as the sexualization of power, the sexualization of genocidal techniques. So it is not. It's sexualized, it's not sexual. So it's not sexual energy, right? It's sexualized domination. So yes, rape is a form of domination whenever it's used. Men are raped as well as women. There's some indication, we don't have good statistics on this, because as difficult as it is for women to report rape, it seems even more difficult often for men to report it, particularly in strongly patriarchal societies. But from the studies that do exist, it looks like the rape of men and boys is much higher during genocide than in peacetime. So in conflicts where there's a high level of rape of men and boys observed by humanitarian workers, for example, I think that's a sign of potential genocide, perhaps even more so than the rape of women and girls. And I say that because the rape of women and girls is very high during most conflict situations and certainly most forms of mass atrocity, including genocide. Where it becomes an actual weapon of genocide is either when it is demanded by authorities, right? So it's imposed from above, like we saw in Bosnia, in the Bosnian genocide, where Serb units used, right, and Serb leaders used rape intentionally as a way to destroy the social fabric of Bosniak Muslim families and communities. Or in the Rwandan genocide, where there's a lot of evidence that rape was seen as a weapon of genocide. But it can also be used simply because, this has not been well theorized, and that's one of the jobs that stands to be done in the study of gender and genocide. But there seems to be an understanding amongst perpetrators of the destructive nature of rape, right? And if you look at rape, there are some studies of rape, not genocidal rape, not rape during genocide, just rape as such, that talk about, for example, rape as a form of social death, rape as a destruction of female identity, rape as a hate crime, rape as a form of feminicide, so a form of sort of genocide against women specifically, right? Which all point to the extent to which rape in peacetime may actually be an identity-based form of violence committed against a woman as a woman, in her capacity as this identity of woman. Which would mean that at times of genocide, naturally rape is going to be seen as a useful tool, even if it's not ordered from above. It's just understood within patriarchal systems as one of the most useful tools in destroying power and identity and historical agency that exists. And if you want to read a little bit more about that, perhaps you already have, look at Catherine McKinnon's work in her book called Are Women Human? She has 2 articles on genocide sexuality, right? And then on the Bosnian case of genocide, where she looks at rape being kind of an extension of violent male domination from peacetime, rape during genocide being an extension of this violent male domination during peacetime. I hope that answers the question.
She continues by saying, I've heard that Hitler copied the Gulag structure from the USSR to build its concentration camps. Can you confirm or reject this information? And if it's true, considering the Ukrainian Holodomor and the horrible things that happened during the Stalin period, doesn't that make Stalin more of a devil than Hitler, in the way people recognize both of them? We know that Stalin is remembered, at least in Russia, and post-Soviet states, as someone who won the war.
Well, on the historical note of Hitler copying the Gulag system, I actually don't know the answer to that. And maybe Joyce, let's get Joyce in the conversation about that one point, but I want to answer the other ones before I forget from my perspective. I mean, if you want to read about that, read Timothy Snyder's book, Bloodlands, where he looks at kind of the mutual interpenetration of these 2 totalitarian systems, Stalin's USSR and Hitler's Third Reich. And he looks at kind of the genocides committed by both. There's another really good book on Stalin's genocides. It's called just that, Stalin's Genocides, by a wonderful historian named Norman Naimark. And Timothy Snyder determines that, the numbers dead, right? The numbers of murders committed by each of these totalitarian leaders are very similar, so very close, but Hitler comes out a little bit higher. He killed more people than Stalin in aggregate. So, so I don't know, who's the worst devil? That's so hard. It depends on who you're talking to. I imagine both of them were genocidal, totalitarian leaders and ruined the lives of millions upon millions of people, right, for many generations to come. So I think they're sparring for equality in that department, I would say.
Okay, Seta writes, I was wondering for genocide in China, how this fits into this title, because they use both gender to violate and torture. But what I can see are that women are forcibly pushed for abortion and pushed to marry with the Han Chinese, so that they're always the victim in any case.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think what can happen, I mean, I think that what's happening to the Uyghurs is clearly a case of genocide. What really got international attention was this use of camps, right? Because we associate that with genocide. But I think these reproductive practices are, in a sense, more suggestive of a genocidal ideology because they target precisely the ability of Uyghurs to reproduce themselves, right? So, so there you actually see an almost explicit attempt to undermine Uyghur longevity as an identity, and to kind of convert it to a Han. So this imposition of the identity of the perpetrator group, right, convert it to kind of a Han Chinese identity. So I think that's a really good case. We're looking at the experience of women, and then the reproductive techniques of genocide can help us see a genocidal pattern that otherwise, may not be so clear. And it certainly helps us make the case and recognize, and this goes to the question of why is it important to call something genocide when it's genocide? And one of the ways I answer that is that genocide is a really radical process. It's not simply a historical process without, without a kind of dynamism within it. Written into the script of genocide is a constantly radicalizing dynamic. And that means that however bad it is today, it's probably going to be worse tomorrow. And there are many ways to explain that, and one can get into that, but it's just something we've seen from all cases, is that without some kind of pressure to stop, right, whether that comes from outside or internally somehow, or natural disaster, or whatever it is, genocide is self-radicalizing. Genocidaires create a kind of paranoiac universe where they're constantly finding new categories of people to target. Over time, whatever techniques of genocide the genocidaires are using, a victim group cannot sustain its dynamism within that kind of a situation, and may succumb to, total or semi-total forms of destruction. So genocide needs to be, if we see inklings of genocide, it needs to be named, shamed, and dealt with in one way or another early on if possible, because it only gets worse. You can't think it away, and genocidaires don't deconstruct their own process once they've started.
Okay, so Alan Whitehorn has a comment.
Hi, Alan.
The dynamic dualism of exploitation versus extermination can be seen in the Spanish conquest of the Americas, where the Spanish killed so many enslaved indigenous peoples that the Spanish colonialists opted to import more slaves from Africa.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I think that's great. It's like a collected volume coming together here. Yes. And that's awesome.
And Jenna says, this is a fascinating perspective to learn about, as I am more familiar with conceptualizing slavery as a dehumanizing economic and capitalist process. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering if there are any potential benefits for Black Americans today for UN recognition as genocide, perhaps in the case of reparations, prison reform. What do you think?
Yeah, Jenna, I actually agree with you. I think that, if you look at the history of using genocide to articulate, and I don't mean using cynically, I simply mean, using this concept to help understand what's happening in the US when it comes to white supremacy and the treatment, and anti-Black racism, let's put it that way, and the treatment of African Americans as a consequence. The history of using that term has had severe negative impacts on the people using it. So it's been a hard struggle, and they haven't received much support in it, and have been seen as radical when the intellectual production behind it, particularly if you read We Charge Genocide, is high quality, right? It's a good study, and no one has challenged its empirical basis. So the consequences have been negative and hard on African Americans making the claim. On the other hand, I think there's a very good case to be made, and I think, Jenna, you hit the nail on the head when you said that that maybe this would be helpful in reparations or in thinking about an accountability system that would recognize and help heal the long-term wound that is caused in a community by genocidal practices over so many generations in particular. You know, the term, whenever one tries to use it as a white American, for example, I'll speak, to refer to the case of slavery, the case of Black Americans, one opens oneself up to using genocide as a label and having good intentions, but you're using it as a label, right? And of course, genocide's a useful label because it gets people going and it gets people to pay attention. But I actually think we have to resist that and, you know, always point out that no, genocide is in a sense a forensic category. It helps us see a crime, right? Just as any other criminal categories help us see crimes and understand what they are, and then understand what measures should be taken to address the wrong and the harm that was done. And if we look at it as genocide, yes, then reparations are on the table, because we often speak of reparations after genocide, right? Forms of investment in community healing and community structuring are on the table. It helps people understand and maybe work against the internalization of genocidal practices. That is a long-term consequence of genocide, as Andrea Smith points out. So I think there are many ways in which that a recognition of that dimension of anti-Black racism in the US would be very helpful, not just to African Americans, but to you know, the strength of US democracy as well.
So Bruna has a comment and a question. So she writes, as a more legal type of genocide scholar, calling Black violence as genocidal always annoyed me. However, the respect for the movement made me rethink my position, and your talk was essential on my understanding. So thank you very much.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you. I'm glad. I'd love to continue the conversation, so feel free to email me.
Perfect. And she does have a question. She says, in Brazil, there are a lot of similarities to police brutality against the Black population. Yeah. As a matter of fact, it has gotten worse with the ascension of the presidency.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Oh.
Bolsonaro.
Oh, yep, here it is. There's a part 2, sorry. Besides the structural violence, people, including Supreme Court judges, are calling the president's policies towards COVID as genocidal. Any thoughts on the Brazilian case?
Well, you know, that's interesting. I think the Brazilian case, there's a very good case to be made that the COVID policies in terms of indigenous Brazilians is genocidal, and at least will have genocidal effects for sure on those communities. I'm not aware enough of the kind of intellectual tradition that Bolsonaro is coming out of to make statements about him, but the political tradition, which I know a little bit more about, so I'm not sure about his ideology and his ideological tradition, but the political tradition in Brazil, yeah, I mean, they've inherited many of the problems that the United States has inherited. They have this dual sort of genocide or dual genocidal practices against indigenous people and against people of African descent in Brazil that's very similar to the United States. They've had similar legal legal architecture around race in Brazil that's very similar to the United States. So I think the case is very strong. You know, and of course the resistance that immediately occurs when we start saying, well, what about Brazil then? Or what about, well, then genocide's everywhere, right? I happen to think, unfortunately, that genocide is a rather common crime. It rarely reaches what we could call the form or the stage of mass murder along the lines of the Holocaust. But in terms of an intent and in terms of a goal, it's really quite common to do away with a perceived problem by doing away with the group that is seen as the carrier of that problem. And so Bolsonaro and Trump share, I think, share in their approach to COVID in particular, a threat that they could be reasonably accused of pursuing genocidal ends through the use of a pandemic and the refusal to protect the most vulnerable populations from its effects and consequences.
We do have a comment from Joyce. Since the US myth of democracy, greatness is so strong and embedded, could you comment on how, in fact, recent social and political protests, such as the Black Lives Matter, makes large groups of Americans feel very vulnerable and challenged? And how does this link to gender identity?
Well, which groups are we talking about here, okay, I'll answer it the way I understand it, and Joyce, jump in if I'm answering the wrong question, right? But I think that there are many things that, but now we're getting very contemporary and very political, but I think there are many things that went into Trump's popularity in 2016 and that have sustained his popularity and that he has exploited because he knows it has sustained him. And this will probably not be news to anybody, and it's certainly not, some kind of great insight on my part. But one is the perceived threat to elite status experienced by white American men, particularly those who have been negatively impacted by economic policies pursued in the United States since at least the 1980s, right? And this takes on many forms: the destruction of traditional forms of masculine labor, right? The destruction of unions, which were a way for masculinity to express itself in solidarity with other laborers, right? And outside of the dominant hegemonic forms of masculinity, which were forged through plantations and land ownership, right? And ownership of the means of production, as the scholars who influenced We Charge Genocide would say. So you have, groups of people who feel that that they're not getting their due, right, as former elite members of our society, and who also are not finding other ways of expressing their human dignity, other mechanisms for the expression of their value and human dignity. And that, that sense of vulnerability, of humiliation, is often experienced more by men than by women, although women are an important part of the story of Trump's rise to power. And yet Trump's acceptance by so many voters has been very much driven by his expression of masculinist tropes, right? Violence, hatred, divisiveness, kind of the promulgation of scenarios of power that are deeply steeped in cruelty and humiliation and degradation of the other. This kind of militant hyper-masculinism, what you could even call a kind of genocidal masculinity, really accounts for a lot of his appeal to people who feel that they have been humiliated. And many of those are white men, and as we know, they are some of his strongest supporters. And I don't want to make this simply a story of class, because we know that, across classes, he's very popular within that demographic, right? So there are shared senses of vulnerability that are not only economic in nature. And so then it becomes a question, right, for strategy, for political strategy. How do we know, for example, that genocides as mass murder can emerge out of times of struggle just like the ones we see in the United States today, where traditionally powerful groups' power is being eroded in one way or another, and that is blamed on another group who seem to benefit from change, whether or not that's true. Many people in the Trump camp really believe there's A, a white genocide, and B, that the proof of that, you know, is what we hear, that the United States by 2050 may be majority people of color, right? So, so they've taken this information and turned it into intentional assault by the winners of what they see as this kind of biological competition, this existential biological competition, as an intentional assault against them. When people are claiming that, they often are projecting their own imaginations, right? Their own imaginary onto others. And so we know Adolf Hitler suggested that there was an international, not only a world conspiracy of Jews against, you know, Christian Germans or Aryan Germans, but also simply a world conspiracy, right, of non-Jews as well who were in league with Jews to get rid of, to annihilate Germany and Aryan Germans. And, you know, he was talking about that already in the early 20s. And that was more an indication of what he was thinking, the way he was thinking about power. Similar with Slobodan Milosevic, very famously claimed that Muslims were committing a biological genocide against Christian Serbs by having more babies in places like Kosovo. And later on, right, he supported the commission of genocide by the rump sort of Serbian state within Bosnia-Herzegovina against Bosniak Muslims. So, you know, I worry about that projection from precisely this group of threatened elites that have been identified in the literature as you know, as potential threats for genocide down the road. And then in terms of strategy, how do you, in a time of great change, how do you advocate for change without reinforcing the very fears that are generating genocidal ideology and potentially genocidal policies? That's a tough thing. Yeah, and I don't have an answer for it. And in a way, I think that it's very difficult to calibrate resistance against the potential of a group to commit genocide. And the best thing to do is speak as plainly as possible, and as many people to speak as plainly as possible about what we see the threats to be and why we think those threats are important to address. I do think that one of the most important maybe languages we can pick up from things like We Charge Genocide is the language of social inclusion, a language that does not participate in division while pointing out the harms. You can point out harms done to a group without participating necessarily in division. You'll always be accused of being divisive. So it's not what you're accused of, it's the actual language that you're using. And I think Black Lives Matter uses that language very well, which is that all lives matter, but we need to focus on Black lives because they're not treated as if they matter, right? Or, you know, the language that suggests that we're all in it together, yeah? So the way we strengthen democracy is to look at those aspects of our system that are really failing groups and that are leaving them at the mercy of genocidal practices. I think if we introduce the term genocide to the language, it would be very difficult. There are consequences to that. There'd be a lot of resistance in genocide studies, as there already is. But in the United States, the introduction of that term could help forge alliances between groups and help people understand exactly why the need is so compelling to focus on Black lives and Native lives and the lives of people of color in the United States today. So it's jujitsu in a sense. It's very, very difficult, I think, and I appreciate what I understand you to be saying, Joyce, because I tend to think, and perhaps you do as well, that that there are so many indicators of threatened genocide as mass murder or genocide as mass atrocity, not this stochastic system that we see happening throughout history in the United States with pockets of massacre. We may be hitting another pocket of massacre, and there's the risk now of it being coordinated by some larger state entity because of who we see in power today. So these are real concerns, and it's a difficult subject. I don't know if anyone else out there has something they want to say about that. Please do.
Thank you so much. This was a wonderful webinar. We do have a few requests for follow-up with like the presentation and a few of the books and articles that you referenced throughout, so we can follow up with everyone in an email after this. Yeah, but I want to say thank you very much for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity. I really appreciate it, and I'm sorry I can't see everybody. It's strange and a shame, but
yes, I know.
You tell me if you want to keep discussing. So, okay.
That's great. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.